There is a face you have seen before. You have seen it carved into temple walls, pressed into the centers of ancient shields, painted above doorways as a ward against evil. It is a face of impossible contradiction, beautiful and ruined at once, wreathed in living serpents, eyes wide with something that is not quite rage and not quite sorrow, but something older and more total than either. It is a face that, in the mythology of ancient Greece, could end a man in an instant, not wound him, not frighten him, end him, turning warm flesh to cold stone with nothing more than a glance. That face belongs to Medusa, and for nearly 3,000 years it has not left us. She is perhaps the most recognizable monster in all of Western mythology, more familiar than the Minotaur, more immediately understood than the Hydra, more deeply embedded in human imagination than almost any other creature the ancient world produced. And yet, for all that recognition, she is also among the most misunderstood. The story that most people know, the woman with snake hair who turns men to stone, slain by a hero with a mirrored shield, is real. But it is only the outermost layer of something far more complex, far more ancient, and considerably more troubling. Medusa was one of 3 sisters known as the Gorgons, Stheno, Euryale, and Medusa, daughters in most accounts of the sea deities Phorcys and Ceto, ancient primordial beings who predated the Olympian gods themselves. The name Gorgon comes from the Greek word gorgos, meaning terrible or fierce. But here is where the story already begins to fracture. Of the 3 Gorgon sisters, only Medusa was mortal. Her sisters, Stheno and Euryale, were immortal, unkillable, beyond the reach of any hero's blade. Medusa alone could die. It is a detail that changes everything about how we should read her story, because it means her vulnerability was not weakness, it was singularity. She was the only one who mattered, in the way that only things which can be lost truly matter. In the earliest accounts of Greek myth, Medusa was not always a monster at all. The poet Hesiod, writing in the 8th century before the Common Era, describes the Gorgons as fearsome beings, but does not always cast Medusa as the hideous creature she would later become in popular imagination. In some earlier traditions, she was even considered a figure of beauty, a being of tremendous power who was transformed, cursed, made monstrous through no fault of her own. The version that hardened into myth over centuries tells us she was once a mortal woman of striking beauty, a priestess in the temple of Athena, the goddess of wisdom and war. It was there that Poseidon, god of the seas, either seduced or assaulted her. The ancient sources are not always careful with this distinction, within the sacred walls of Athena's own temple. And it was Athena who, in her rage at the desecration of her sanctuary, punished not the god, but the woman. She transformed Medusa's hair into a writhing mass of living serpents, made her gaze lethal to any living person who met it directly, and rendered her face so terrible that the sight of it alone was said to freeze the blood. The injustice of this transformation has not escaped modern readers, and it did not entirely escape the ancient ones either. Medusa is, at her core, a figure shaped by forces she could not control, and punished for things done to her rather than by her. She is a creature of compounded wrongs, and perhaps that is precisely why she has endured. Because her tragedy resonates in ways that pure monstrousness never quite can. But make no mistake about what she was, once that transformation was complete. Medusa, in her Gorgon form, was an entity of catastrophic power. She lived in a realm beyond the edges of the known world, in some accounts at the far western reaches of the earth near the land of the dead, in others on an island shrouded from mortal sight. She was surrounded by the bodies of men and animals she had turned to stone. Her domain a kind of petrified graveyard, a landscape of what hubris and desperation had delivered to her doorstep. Her gaze was instantaneous and absolute. There was no surviving a direct look, There was no shaking it off or recovering from a brief exposure. You looked at Medusa and you became stone. Not metaphorically, not spiritually, but physically and permanently. A statue frozen in whatever expression your face had worn in the last moment of your life. She also possessed wings, great leathery wings in many accounts, and could move through the air with a speed that made escape on foot simply impossible. The serpents in her hair were not decorative. They were alive, venomous, and capable of independent action. She was, in combat terms, a layered problem. Approach her from the front, and her gaze ends you. Approach her from behind, and her serpents warn her. Attempt to flee, and her wings close the distance. Heroes who marched to face her without preparation did not return. There is no record of anyone defeating Medusa through courage alone. She required a specific kind of cunning, and even then, even with divine assistance, it was extraordinarily close. That cunning belonged to Perseus. His encounter with Medusa is one of the oldest complete hero narratives in Greek mythology, and it remains the most famous confrontation involving her. Perseus, the son of Zeus and the mortal Danae, was sent to retrieve Medusa's head by the king Polydectes, a task framed as an impossible errand designed to ensure Perseus would never return. What Polydectes did not account for was the intervention of the gods. Athena gave Perseus a polished shield of bronze, instructing him to use its reflective surface to view Medusa indirectly. Hermes provided him with an adamantine sickle, a blade capable of cutting through the Gorgon's flesh. The nymphs of the north furnished him with a helm of darkness, winged sandals, and a magical satchel to contain the head once it was severed. Perseus flew to the lair where the Gorgons slept, moved carefully through the field of stone figures, and struck while Medusa lay unconscious, never once looking at her directly, guided only by her reflection in the bronze shield. And still it was barely enough. The moment the blade fell, her immortal sisters woke in a fury of grief and vengeance, and Perseus fled wearing the helm of invisibility, carrying the severed head in the satchel, flying hard over land and sea with Stheno and Euryala screaming somewhere close behind in the darkness. He escaped, but it was not the clean, triumphant victory that later retellings tend to suggest. It was a desperate flight from something that could not be killed and would not stop. Medusa's power did not end with her death. Her severed head retained the full force of her petrifying gaze, and Perseus used it as a weapon on multiple occasions in the days that followed, turning the sea monster Cetus to stone to rescue Andromeda, and later petrifying the Titan Atlas, who became, in some accounts, the very mountain range that bears his name. From her spilled blood rose Pegasus, the winged horse, and the giant Chrysaor, her children by Poseidon, born at the moment of her death, in a detail that is as mythologically strange as it is poetically perfect. Even in destruction, Medusa generated life. Even headless, she shaped the world. What Medusa symbolizes in Greek mythology is not simple, and it has never been simple. She is simultaneously a monster and a victim, a punishment and a power, a warning to those who would transgress sacred spaces, and a dark emblem of what happens to women whose existence becomes inconvenient to those with authority over them. The Greeks placed her image on temples, on armor, on coins, and on the shields of warriors, not because they wanted to invoke evil, but because they wanted to invoke her power. The Gorgonian, as the image of her face came to be called, was an apotropaic symbol, a ward, a protector, a thing so terrible that evil itself would flinch from it. They feared her, and because they feared her, they used her. This is the beginning of her story. There is considerably more to tell. To understand what Medusa truly was, you must first understand what she came from. And what she came from was older than almost anything else in Greek mythology. Older than Zeus, older than the great wars of the gods, older than the structured marble-columned world of Mount Olympus with its hierarchies and politics and divine soap operas. Medusa's origins reach back into a period of Greek cosmological thinking that most casual readers never encounter, a dim and primordial era when the world was not yet organized into the neat taxonomies of god and mortal and monster, but was instead a churning, half-formed thing full of vast beings that were less like persons and more like forces. Her parents were Phorcys and Ceto. These are not household names today, and they were not quite household names even in ancient Greece, where the Olympian gods dominated popular worship and ritual. But in the genealogical architecture of Greek myth, Phorcys and Ceto occupied a position of extraordinary antiquity and power. They were sea deities, but not in the way that Poseidon was a sea deity, with his trident and his temper and his recognizably human jealousies. Phorcys and Ceto were the sea understood as something formless and terrifying, the sea before ships, before harbors, before any human attempt to name or tame it. Phorcys was the old man of the sea, a deity associated with the hidden dangers lurking in deep water. Ceto, whose very name became the Greek root for sea monster, the same root from which we derive the word cetacean, was the sea as vastness and threat, the open water that swallows things whole and returns nothing. Their children, accordingly, were not gods of civilization or order. They were something rawer than that. From Phorcys and Ceto came the Gorgons, Stheno, Euryale, and Medusa. From them also came the Graeae, three ancient women who shared a single eye and a single tooth between them, the Hesperides and the sea serpent Ladon, who together guarded the golden apples at the edge of the world, and Echidna, the half-woman, half-serpent mother of many of mythology's greatest monsters. And from Phorcys and Ceto came also the great sea serpent Scylla, who would later terrorize the straits between Sicily and the Italian mainland. This was Medusa's family. This was the blood she carried. She was not an aberration or an accident. She was an expression of something deep and consistent in the mythological imagination, a lineage that specialized, if you will, in beings that embodied what humans feared most about the natural world. The Gorgons themselves, in the oldest surviving textual sources, are described in terms that emphasize their physical grotesquerie rather than any tragic backstory. Hesiod, in his Theogony, composed sometime around 700 before the Common Era, and among the oldest systematic accounts of Greek mythology we possess, describes the Gorgons as dwellers beyond the famous stream of ocean at the edge of night, near the singing Hesperides. He names all three sisters. He notes that Medusa alone is mortal. He does not, at this point in the tradition, explain why. He does not offer a transformation narrative, a curse, a moment of divine retribution. In Hesiod, Medusa simply is what she is, a mortal Gorgon living at the furthest reaches of the world, as though her mortality was simply a fact of her nature rather than a punishment imposed upon her. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it fundamentally alters the emotional landscape of her character. In Hesiod's telling, there is no injustice at the center of Medusa's story. There is only a being, terrible and mortal, existing at the margin of the knowable world. The tragedy, the priestess, the assault, the wrathful goddess, comes later, attributed most fully to Ovid writing in the 1st century of the Common Era, 700 years after Hesiod. The Medusa that most of us carry in our minds is largely a Roman invention, or at least a Roman elaboration, layered over a much older and less emotionally legible creature. In the very earliest strata of Greek visual culture, before the literary tradition had fully crystallized, the Gorgon's image appeared on pottery, architectural friezes, and votive offerings in a form that art historians refer to as the archaic Gorgon. And it looks almost nothing like what we imagine today. The archaic Gorgon face is frontal, staring directly out at the viewer in a way that almost no other figure in early Greek art does. It is wide-mouthed, often shown with a lolling tongue and prominent tusks or teeth. The eyes are enormous and circular. It is, in a word, a mask, or rather it is something so old that the concept of mask and face have not yet separated. Scholars believe this frontal stare, this direct confrontation of the viewer's gaze, may be among the oldest religious images in the Greek world, predating the Olympian mythology that would eventually be built around it. The face was the power. The story came later, assembled around a terror that had already existed for centuries. This matters because it suggests that Medusa, at her deepest roots, is not primarily a narrative figure at all. She is an apotropaic image, a protective, warding symbol whose power derives not from any story but from the visceral human response to being stared at. Psychologists today will tell you that the perception of being watched, particularly by large, symmetrical, forward-facing eyes, triggers involuntary threat responses in the human nervous system. We are wired, at a level far below conscious thought, to register the direct gaze of another creature as a potential danger. The Gorgon's face exploits this. It is a face designed, whether consciously or through cultural accumulation, to activate the oldest alarm systems in the human brain. It was not frightening because the Greeks told stories about it. The Greeks told stories about it because it was frightening, because something in the image itself demanded explanation. By the classical period, the 5th and 4th centuries before the Common Era, the Athens of Pericles and Sophocles, and the great flowering of Greek philosophy and drama, the Gorgon image had evolved considerably from its archaic origins. The face had become more conventionally human, more feminine, more beautiful, even in its terror. The tusks receded, the tongue drew back, the serpents became more elaborate, more intentional, and, crucially, the literary tradition had begun to build around the image a fully realized mythology, one that included parentage, transformation, encounter with heroes, and ultimate defeat. What had begun as an unnameable face staring from a pot had become a woman with a history, a wound, and a death. Yet even as the narrative grew more sophisticated, the fundamental purpose of Medusa's image never changed. The Gorgonian continued to appear on temples, on shields, on coins, on door lintels, on armor, on the bows of ships. The goddess Athena herself wore it on her breastplate, the aegis, where it served as the ultimate symbol of divine protection and invulnerability. Zeus, in some accounts, bore it there as well. The most powerful deities in the Greek pantheon chose to present Medusa's face as a kind of divine credential, as if to say, we are the kind of beings who can carry this without being destroyed by it. To own the Gorgon's face was to have mastered the most primal terror. To wear it was to project that mastery outward at anyone who dared look at you. There is something deeply recursive in this. Medusa's power, the power to petrify through eye contact, became, once that power was captured and contained, the ultimate symbol of power itself. The thing that made her dangerous made her useful. The thing that made her monstrous made her sacred. She was, in this sense, not destroyed by the Greek tradition so much as she was absorbed into it. Her terror converted into currency, her monstrousness repurposed into meaning. She began at the edges of the world, in the dark water beyond ocean, at the outermost margin of what the Greek imagination could reach. And she moved, slowly over centuries, to the very center of that imagination, onto the breastplate of the goddess of wisdom, onto the shields of soldiers going into battle, onto the foundations of the temples where the Greeks made their most serious attempts to speak to the divine. She was, in the end, too powerful to leave at the edge, too essential, too true to something the Greeks needed to say about the world and could not say any other way. They brought her in from the darkness, named her, gave her parents and sisters and a history and an ending. And then they put her face on everything they wanted to protect. Before she was a monster, she was a woman who served a goddess. That is the version of Medusa's story that the Roman poet Ovid committed to his Metamorphoses in the 1st century of the Common Era. And it is the version that has proven the most durable, the most haunting, and the most difficult to reconcile with any comfortable understanding of divine justice. Ovid was not writing mythology in the way that Hesiod wrote it, as theology, as cosmological record, as the serious business of explaining where the world came from and why the gods behaved as they did. Ovid was a literary artist of extraordinary sophistication, a poet who understood that the most powerful stories are the ones that make you feel something you did not expect to feel, including discomfort about the figures you were supposed to admire. His telling of Medusa is not incidental to the broader mythology. It is, in many respects, the telling that matters most, because it insists that before the monster, there was a person, and before the person became a monster, something was done to her. In Ovid's account, Medusa was mortal, and she was beautiful, renowned for her beauty, in fact, in that way that ancient myth often uses beauty as both gift and liability, as a quality so conspicuous that it invites catastrophe. Her hair in particular was celebrated, described as her most striking feature, the thing people remarked upon when they spoke of her. She was also, in this version of the story, a devotee of Athena, a woman who had aligned herself with the goddess of wisdom and warfare and the domestic arts, who had chosen a life of sacred service within Athena's temple. The precise nature of that service varies by telling. Some accounts describe her as a priestess, others simply place her within the temple as a worshipper, a supplicant, a mortal who had given her devotion to a divine patron. The details differ. The essential fact does not. She was in Athena's house. She was, by every code the ancient world recognized, under Athena's protection. Then Poseidon came, the god of the seas, brother to Zeus, one of the 3 great Olympian powers who divided the world between them after the defeat of the Titans, came to the temple of Athena, and there he took Medusa. The Greek sources, as noted before, are not always precise about the nature of this encounter. The word used in various tellings can imply seduction as readily as force, and some readers, both ancient and modern, have interpreted the encounter as a willing union. But the weight of the tradition, particularly in Ovid and in the many subsequent readings that the story has generated across millennia, leans towards something Medusa did not choose. She was in a sacred space. She was a mortal in the presence of a god whose power was virtually without limit, and the location itself, the sanctuary of another Olympian deity, makes the idea of uncomplicated consent almost impossible to sustain. Whatever else was happening, something was being violated. The sanctity of the temple, the autonomy of the woman inside it, quite possibly both, and Athena's response. This is the moment that has generated more moral argument than perhaps any other single beat in Greek mythology, was to punish Medusa, not Poseidon. Medusa, the goddess of wisdom, of justice, of the carefully reasoned weighing of things, looked at what had happened in her temple and directed her wrath at the mortal woman who had been wronged within it. There are ancient commentators who attempted to rationalize this. Athena, they argued, could not act against a god of Poseidon's stature. The divine hierarchy of Olympus made it effectively impossible for her to seek direct redress from her uncle, a figure of equivalent cosmic authority. Others suggested that the desecration of the temple itself, regardless of Medusa's innocence, made the temple and everyone inside it impure, that Athena's transformation was less a punishment than a kind of quarantine, a furious attempt to reconsecrate by removing the tainted thing. Still others read Athena's action as a perverse form of protection. By making Medusa monstrous and untouchable, The goddess ensured no god or man would ever lay hands on her again. These are not entirely unconvincing arguments. Greek myth is not a moral system built to satisfy modern sensibilities, and it is worth being careful about imposing contemporary frameworks wholesale onto a tradition that operated by entirely different ethical logic. The Greeks understood power as something that flowed through hierarchy, and their gods were not moral exemplars, so much as amplified versions of human impulses, jealous, territorial, proud, capable of great generosity and staggering cruelty, often within the same story. Athena acting against Medusa rather than Poseidon would not have seemed as obviously unjust to a Greek audience as it seems to us. It would have seemed, perhaps, simply like what power does, like water flowing downhill, collecting not at its source but at the lowest point. But Ovid was not simply describing, he was shaping, and the shape he chose, the detail he selected, the emphasis he placed, makes it very difficult to read the scene as anything other than a second violation following the first. He tells us Medusa's beauty was the occasion. He tells us the goddess was enraged. And he tells us what the goddess did. She transformed Medusa's celebrated hair, the feature most remarked upon, most admired, most distinctly hers, into a mass of living serpents, replaced the thing that had made her beautiful with the thing that would make her monstrous. There is a savage precision in this choice that feels less like an impersonal divine mechanism and more like the specific, targeted cruelty of someone who knows exactly where to strike to cause the most damage. The transformation of the hair was not the whole of it. The gaze followed, the lethal, petrifying stare that would become Medusa's defining characteristic and her most terrible weapon. In some accounts, the entire face shifted, becoming the broad, terrible mask that we recognize from the archaic Gorgon images. The wide eyes, the open mouth, the expression frozen somewhere between fury and anguish. Her body in certain tellings acquired wings. Great dark wings that gave her the sky as well as the sea's edge to retreat to. The serpents in her hair were venomous, alive, capable of independent movement, hissing and striking at anything that came too close. She was, when the transformation was complete, no longer recognizable as the woman she had been. She was something categorically different, something that could not live among humans, could not be approached, could not be looked at, something that had to be exiled to the furthest edge of the world. And exile is precisely what followed. In the mythological geography of the ancient Greek world, Medusa took up residence at the absolute margin of the known, beyond the stream of ocean that the Greeks believed encircled the earth, in a land touched by the cold breath of the far north. Or, in other accounts, in the extreme west where the sun went down and the dead passed through on their way to what waited for them. She was placed, in other words, in the geography of things that cannot be integrated into the living world. She was put with the night, with the dead, with the oceanic unknown. She was made a resident of the threshold between existence and whatever lies beyond it. Her sisters Thano and Euryala came with her, or perhaps had always been there. The tradition is not always clear on this point, and in some versions the sisters were Gorgons from birth, not transformed alongside Medusa, but simply native to the monstrous. What is consistent is that Medusa, now changed, now lethal, now impossible to face, withdrew from the world of mortals and human sight. She did not pursue men. She did not hunt cities or raid coastlines or seek victims in the way that other mythological monsters often do. She withdrew. She existed in her terrible place and was, so far as the surviving stories tell us, mostly left alone, until the world came looking for her. It always does. That is the nature of power. You can exile it, place it beyond ocean, give it serpent hair and a killing gaze, surround it with the stone figures of everything that has already failed to survive it. But power in the mythological imagination does not diminish with distance. If anything, it compounds. Every hero who did not return from the margins of the world made the thing at those margins more real, more necessary to confront, more magnetic to the kind of man who could not resist proving himself against the thing that had already destroyed everyone else. And there is something else worth considering, something the myth encodes without ever quite stating directly. In becoming what she became, Medusa did not only lose something, she also gained something that no mortal woman in the Greek mythological world was supposed to possess. She gained the power to stop men absolutely, not to persuade them, not to appeal to them, not to outlast them or outlove them or wait for their mercy, but to halt them completely with a glance. In a world where mortal women had almost no agency in the face of divine or heroic power, Medusa became, through a punishment meant to destroy her, the single most dangerous thing any man or god could encounter. She could not be negotiated with. She could not be charmed. She could not be reasoned into standing aside or looking the other way. She simply, and absolutely, stopped you. The goddess who punished her had created, in her fury, something she had not intended to create, something that could not be undone by any ordinary means, something that the greatest hero of his generation would need the help of 3 gods and an arsenal of divine equipment simply to approach. Athena had tried to reduce Medusa. Instead, she had made her permanent. The serpents twisted in her hair, the world kept its distance, and somewhere at the edge of the world, beyond the ocean and the night and the field of stone figures that used to be men, she waited, not patiently, not with purpose, not with any knowable intention, simply there, simply what she had been made into, simply Medusa. The task was designed to be a death sentence. That is the first thing to understand about why Perseus went to find Medusa. Not because he sought glory in any pure or uncomplicated sense, not because he had heard of the Gorgons and felt the pull of ambition, but because a king who wanted him dead had given him an impossible errand and dressed it as an honor. The king's name was Polydectes, ruler of the island of Seriphos, where Perseus and his mother Danae had washed ashore years earlier, refugees inside a wooden chest thrown into the sea by Danae's own father, the king of Argos, who had received a prophecy that any son born to his daughter would one day kill him. Polydectes had developed an obsession with Danae. Perseus, now a young man, was the obstacle between Polydectes and his mother, and so the king, at a banquet, created the occasion he needed. He announced he was seeking gifts from his guests, gifts of horses, and when Perseus declared he had no horse to give and would instead bring whatever the king asked, Polydectes asked for the head of Medusa. It was a wish framed as a request, a murder framed as a quest. Everyone at that banquet understood what Polydectes understood, that no man had ever returned from Medusa, that the head was not a thing that could be retrieved, that Perseus had offered himself an errand from which he would not come back, and the king had simply closed the trap. Perseus left Seriphos carrying nothing but the rashness of his word, and the particular disadvantage of being young enough to believe that the right kind of courage might be enough to compensate for everything else he lacked. It was not enough. It would never have been enough. And what happens next in the mythology is a carefully structured argument for why heroism in the Greek imagination was never simply a matter of personal virtue or physical excellence. It was always, at its most successful, a collaboration between the mortal and the divine. Perseus could not have reached Medusa alone. He could not have survived the approach, executed the kill, or escaped afterward without direct and substantial intervention from the gods. The story of Perseus and Medusa is, among other things, a story about the limits of human capability, about what happens when the problem genuinely exceeds any individual's capacity to solve it, and what it costs to find help worthy of the problem. The first god to move was Hermes, the messenger, the god of travelers and of cunning and of the roads between worlds. Hermes came to Perseus not with reassurance but with information and equipment. The practical gifts of a deity who understood that good intentions and bad preparation produced the same outcome as cowardice. He gave Perseus an adamantine sickle, a blade forged from a material harder than anything the mortal world contained, capable of cutting through the neck of a Gorgon where ordinary iron would shatter or bend. The choice of weapon was precise and considered. Medusa could not be fought at a distance. She could not be burned or drowned or crushed from afar. She had to be approached, however carefully, and the cut had to be definitive. A blade that might fail was not a blade at all. It was a reason to look up at the wrong moment. Hermes gave Perseus a reason not to hesitate. Athena came as well, the goddess who had cursed Medusa now, in one of the mythology's most quietly extraordinary ironies, provided the instrument of her death. She gave Perseus her own shield, or, in some tellings, a shield polished to the reflective brightness of a mirror, and she gave him the instruction that would make everything else possible. Do not look at Medusa directly. Use the shield's surface as your eye. Navigate by reflection. What you see in the bronze is real enough to guide the blade. What you see with your own eyes will be the last thing you ever see. It is a piece of advice that sounds simple until you consider what it actually requires. Moving through a dark place, among creatures you cannot face, with your back to the most dangerous thing in the room, guiding a blade by a reversed and wobbling image in a piece of curved metal. It requires a steadiness of nerve that almost no one possesses, and a willingness to trust an indirect picture of reality over the instinctive human desire to simply look at what you are trying to kill. There were further gifts still, and they came from the nymphs of the north, figures sometimes called the Hesperides, sometimes identified as guardians of the far reaches, their precise identity shifting between tellings. From them, Perseus received 3 objects that together made the approach to Medusa's lair conceivable. The first was the helm of Hades, the cap of darkness, the same helmet worn by the god of the underworld himself, which rendered its wearer completely invisible to any eye, divine or mortal or monstrous. The second was a pair of winged sandals, which gave Perseus the sky as a road, lifting him above the ground so that he could approach from an altitude that no crawling, earthbound creature could easily detect. The third was the kibisis, a satchel, a simple bag, and yet the most essential item of all, because without a container capable of holding Medusa's severed head safely, every other piece of equipment in the world was useless. The head retained its power after separation from the body. To carry it unprotected was to carry it pointed outward at everything you passed. Satchel was the difference between a weapon and an accident. But even before Perseus could reach Medusa, he faced a preliminary problem that the mythology handles with a detail so strange and so specific that it feels almost archaeological, as though it preserves the memory of something very old. He needed to find out where the Gorgons actually lived, and the only beings who knew were the Graeae, 3 ancient sisters, born old, who shared between them a single eye and a single tooth, passing these organs back and forth as needed. They were, in the mythological genealogy, sisters to the Gorgons, daughters of the same primordial Phorcys and Ceto, inhabiting the same outer margins of the world. Perseus approached them, waited for the moment when the shared eye was in transit between one sister and another, and seized it. He held their vision hostage until they told him what he needed to know. Then he returned the eye and went where they directed him. It is a peculiar passage in an otherwise grave and terrible story, almost comedic in its physical absurdity. 3 ancient women fumbling in the dark for an eyeball, while a young hero stands just out of reach holding their sight in his closed fist. But the strangeness of it is precisely the point. The path to Medusa did not run through noble confrontation or trials of strength. It ran through theft from the blind, through information extracted by leverage, through a moral flexibility that the Greeks called metis. Cunning, practical intelligence, the ability to solve the problem in front of you rather than the problem you would prefer to have. Perseus did not beat the grey. He outsmarted them. And it was that same quality, not strength, not bravery exactly, but the capacity to think sideways under pressure, that would carry him through what came next. He found the Gorgons sleeping. This detail matters more than it might initially appear. Medusa at rest is a different problem from Medusa awake. She cannot direct her gaze. Her serpents are still, or at least stilled enough that the terrible alert they would otherwise provide, hissing, turning, waking their host, is suppressed in the deeper rhythms of whatever sleep a Gorgon falls into. Perseus came to her in the only window the universe offered, in the vulnerable dark of unconsciousness, and even then the approach was agonizing. The field surrounding the Gorgons was not empty. It was populated with stone, statues of men and animals who had come before, frozen at the exact coordinates of their last bad decision, preserved in the perfect specificity of their final moments. Some were mid-stride. Some had their arms raised in a gesture that might have been supplication or might have been attack. They were a record of every attempt that had failed, and Perseus had to move among them, eyes fixed on the bronze face of his shield, navigating by reflection through a graveyard of his predecessors. He reached her. He raised the sickle. He looked only at the shield, at the image of her sleeping face swimming in the polished surface. Close enough now that a single involuntary glance upward would have ended everything, turned all that divine equipment and all that carefully assembled cunning into one more statue in the field. He struck. The blade was equal to the task. The head separated cleanly, and Perseus caught it without looking at it, sliding it directly into the kibbaces, the satchel closing around it before the power in those eyes could find a target. And then Stheno and Euryale woke. The sound of their grief was immediate and absolute. The immortal sisters rose from sleep into full awareness of what had happened and what it meant. Their mortal sister, the only one of them who could be taken, had been taken. They rose and they searched. And this is where the helm of Hades proved its final and most essential value. Perseus was invisible. They could hear him. The mythology implies the sisters circled, questing, their fury filling that cold fireplace like a tide. They could not see him. He was already moving, the winged sandals lifting him away from the ground, carrying him up and out over the impossible geography of the world's edge, flying hard away from two beings who could not be killed and would not stop looking for him. He flew for a very long time. The sisters followed for longer than comfort allows. The mythology does not tell us at exactly what point the sound of their pursuit faded, at what moment Perseus could finally breathe steadily again, at what altitude and distance the grief of the immortal Gorgons became something he could no longer hear. It simply tells us that he escaped, that he crossed back over ocean, back over the rim of the world, back into the geography where mortal men could survive and divine equipment could be quietly explained away as a gift from the gods, which is, of course, exactly what it was. He carried the head. He did not look at it. He would not look at it for some time yet. There were still things it needed to do, still work left for the power Athena had cursed into that face. But that is the business of what comes next. For now, the essential fact is simply this: Perseus had done something that, by every reasonable assessment of the problem, should have been impossible. He had entered a place where everything that had come before him had been turned to stone. He had moved through it unseen, had struck at the one moment the universe offered, and had flown back out alive. He had not beaten Medusa. That is perhaps the most honest way to say it. You do not beat something you cannot face. What he had done was more careful and more strange than beating. He had navigated around the totality of her power, had found the single seam where that power was briefly suspended, and had cut through it cleanly. It was not a triumph of strength over strength. It was a triumph of preparation over terror. And it had worked. Barely, and with the help of every god who found him worth helping. But it had worked. The head was in the bag. The wings carried him forward, and somewhere behind him, growing slowly smaller and finally inaudible in the vastness of the sky, the immortal sisters searched for something they would never find. Death, in the mythology of ancient Greece, was rarely a conclusion. It was more often a transformation, a moment in which one kind of existence ended and another, stranger kind, began. The gods themselves had died and been reborn in various tellings. Heroes had descended into the underworld and returned carrying something they had not possessed before. Even the seasons were understood as a rhythm of dying and return. Persephone drawn down into the dark every year and pulled back into the light, the earth withering and greening in her wake. Death in the Greek imagination was permeable. It was a threshold, not a wall. And of all the figures in Greek mythology who demonstrated this truth most dramatically, most unexpectedly, most lavishly, it was Medusa. She died once, in the dark, while she slept, without ever having the chance to see what was coming. And then, from that single death, the world received things it had never contained before, and a power that could not be extinguished even by the blade that had severed it from its source. The first thing to emerge from her death was the blood. This is where the mythology becomes genuinely strange, where the narrative logic of a hero's quest gives way to something older and more mythologically dense, something that feels less like a story and more like a cosmological event. As the sickle fell, and Medusa's blood met the air, and then the sea beneath her, because some accounts place the encounter close enough to the ocean's edge that the blood fell into the water. Two beings rose from that spill simultaneously. The first was Pegasus, the winged horse, white and perfect and carrying in his body the combined natures of his parentage, the divine uncontrollable wildness of Poseidon, god of horses and of the sea, and the impossible, boundary-defying power of a Gorgon who had turned the sky into her domain. The second was Chrysaor, a giant born already holding a golden sword, whose name means precisely that, he of the golden sword, and whose subsequent mythology, though less celebrated than his brothers, includes fathering the three-bodied giant Geryon, who Heracles would later be tasked with defeating. Consider what the mythology is doing here. Medusa had been violated by Poseidon within a sacred temple. She had been punished for that violation with a transformation so total it displaced her from the human world entirely. She had lived at the edge of the world, untouched and untouchable, for however long the myth's internal timeline allows. And at the moment of her death, the children conceived in that original transgression, children she had carried throughout all the years of her exile, throughout the entire period of her monstrousness, without the myth ever acknowledging their existence, until this precise moment, were born. Not into life exactly, into myth, into the ongoing fabric of the Greek world, where they would become significant in their own right, where Pegasus in particular would go on to carry heroes, to be ridden by Bellerophon against the Chimera, to strike his hoof against the rock of Mount Helicon, and cause the spring of the Muses to flow, to eventually be transformed into a constellation by Zeus himself. Medusa carried the children of her violation for the entire length of her exile and her monstrousness, and they were born only in her death. She could not give them life while she lived it. Only in ending could she pass something forward. There is an emotional weight to this detail that the myth deposits quietly and then moves away from, as though it does not want to be caught dwelling on it. The winged horse that poets and painters would celebrate for 3,000 years. The creature that became synonymous with artistic inspiration and divine favor, and the freedom of the sky. That creature's origin is the blood of a woman who was wronged, punished, exiled, and killed. Pegasus is beautiful because his mother's story was terrible. The spring of the Muses flows, because a hoof struck rock in a moment of divine play, and that hoof belonged to a horse born from a Gorgon's wound. Creation, in this mythology, is inseparable from the cost that preceded it. Beauty does not exist apart from violence. It emerges from it, soaked and shining, into a world that will admire it without always pausing to ask where it came from. But Perseus could not pause either. He had the head in the Kibisis, the sisters somewhere behind him in the dark, and a long way still to travel before he could return to Seriphos and confront the king who had sent him to die. His journey home was not a straight line. The mythology bends it through several further encounters, and in each of them, Medusa's head, still fully potent, still capable of the instantaneous petrification that had defined her in life, served as the instrument of justice, vengeance, rescue, and punishment, depending on what the moment required. The first significant stop was Libya, or the lands of North Africa broadly conceived, through which Perseus flew low enough that drops of Medusa's blood fell from the satchel, or, in some tellings, were carried by the wind off the blood-wetted Kibisis onto the desert below. Where the drops fell, serpents rose from the sand. This is one of the Greek mythology's characteristic explanatory gestures, using the figures of myth to account for features of the natural world that required explanation. Libya was full of serpents. Why? Because Medusa's blood seeded them there. Her body and death continued to generate the same thing her living body had borne. Serpents, creatures of the liminal, of the underground and the shadowed places, associated across nearly every ancient culture with both danger and regeneration. Even as blood seeping into foreign soil, she was still producing her signature. Then came Atlas, the great Titan, condemned by Zeus after the war between the Olympians and the Titans to stand at the western edge of the world and bear the heavens on his shoulders for eternity, was standing precisely where Perseus crossed the sky. The accounts differ on the texture of the encounter. In some versions, Perseus asks Atlas for rest and hospitality, and Atlas refuses, citing a prophecy that a son of Zeus would one day steal the golden apples of the Hesperides from his keeping, and so the Titan turned the hero away. In others, it is simply a confrontation between a figure who stands in Perseus's path and a hero who has, in his Kibisis, the most efficient solution to obstacles the ancient world could conceive. Perseus drew the head from the satchel, carefully, eyes averted, holding it by the hair and angling it outward at the enormous figure before him, and Atlas became stone, the largest of the Titans. The being whose back had supported the weight of the sky since before most of the Greek world's current mythology had even been dreamed, was transformed into a mountain range, the Atlas Mountains of North Africa, which stand to this day on the western edge of the African continent, bearing their enormous weight of sky and cloud above the sea. Another piece of the physical world fixed in place by Medusa's power, wielded now by a mortal hand carrying a divine inheritance in a leather bag. The most celebrated encounter of Perseus's return journey came over the coast of what the Greeks placed in the region of Ethiopia, the kingdom of Cepheus and Cassiopeia, whose daughter Andromeda had been chained to a sea cliff as a sacrifice. The story behind the sacrifice has its own moral architecture worth noting. Cassiopeia had boasted that her daughter's beauty surpassed that of the Nereids, the sea nymphs who attended Poseidon. Poseidon, the same god whose transgression had set the entire Medusa story in motion, responded to this slight by sending the sea monster Cetus to ravage the coastline, and the oracle had declared that only the sacrifice of the princess would satisfy the beast. Andromeda was chained to the rock and left to wait for something enormous to rise out of the water and consume her. Perseus, passing overhead, saw her. The accounts of what exactly moved him vary. Some emphasize love at first sight, others a more calculated assessment of opportunity, and some simply describe him stopping because a person chained to a rock beside the sea is the kind of image that demands a response from anyone passing with the means to intervene. He descended. He negotiated with Cepheus and Cassiopeia, her hand in marriage, the promise of her as his wife in exchange for her rescue, a transaction that reflects the particular moral economy of the ancient world without apology. And then he went to meet Cetus. The sea monster is described variously across the surviving sources: enormous, serpentine, rising from the depths in the way that the ocean at its most threatening simply produces things from below that the surface world has no framework for. Perseus engaged it directly at first, using the winged sandals to stay mobile in the air above the thrashing creature, striking at it with the adamantine sickle. The fight was real, and it was difficult. But it ended the same way that all the encounters on this journey ended, the same way that every confrontation involving the contents of the kibyssus ended. Perseus drew out the head. Cetus, mid-charge, mid-surge, the enormous body still driving forward through the water, met Medusa's gaze and became stone, the sea monster that Poseidon had sent. Another instrument of the god whose original act had caused everything was stopped absolutely, frozen in its final lunge, and sank or stood or simply ceased to move in a way that left Andromeda alive on her rock and the coastline safe. There is a pattern in all of this that becomes more legible as it accumulates. Perseus uses the head with increasing confidence and decreasing hesitation as his journey progresses. The first use, petrifying Atlas, is almost incidental, a blunt solution to a specific problem. By the time Cetus rises from the sea, the head has become something Perseus reaches for with the ease of a practiced hand, a tool he has learned the dimensions of, whose power he has calibrated against real resistance. He has become, in other words, the bearer of Medusa's power in a way that carries its own moral complexity. He did not earn that power through understanding. He took it through cunning and divine assistance, and he deploys it freely, against monsters and against titans, against anyone or anything that stands between him and wherever he is going next. When he finally reached Seriphos, when the long arc of the journey bent back to its origin, back to the island and the king who had sent him to die, Polydectes was in his great hall surrounded by his nobles and his court, and he met the returning Perseus with contempt, with disbelief, with the particular sneering confidence of a man who was absolutely certain the errand he had assigned could not have been completed. Perseus gave him very little time to revise that certainty. He announced that he had returned with what the king had asked for. He opened the satchel. He looked away, and Polydectes and everyone in that hall who had been complicit in the plan to destroy Perseus and take his mother. They became stone where they sat, stone in the attitudes of their last expressions, stone as the men around Medusa's lair had been stone, as Atlas stood stone on the western horizon, as Cetus rested stone somewhere beneath the Ethiopian sea, a hall full of statues where a court had been. Justice administered with a precision that no sword or army could have matched, targeted and total and instantaneous. And then Perseus returned the equipment. The helm of darkness went back to Hades. The winged sandals went back to Hermes. The kibyssus was returned to the nymphs. And the head, Medusa's head, the instrument of everything that had happened since that dark place at the edge of the world, was given to Athena, the goddess who had cursed Medusa, the goddess who had given Perseus the shield that let him survive her. Athena received the head and mounted it on her aegis, her divine breastplate, where it became the Gorgonian, the most recognizable divine emblem in the Greek world, worn by the goddess of wisdom into every war she entered, displayed on the breastplate of Zeus himself on certain occasions, reproduced on temples and shields and coins across the entire Mediterranean world for the next 1,000 years. Medusa, who had been exiled for her existence, who had been made into something the world could not look at, had arrived at last at the center of divine power, not as a person, not as a being capable of her own choices or her own survival, but as an image, as a symbol, as an emblem of a power so absolute, that even the greatest gods in the Greek pantheon wanted it on their chests when they went to war. She had been reduced to a face, but the face was on Athena, and Athena went everywhere. She did not stay dead, not in the way that dying usually implies staying dead. She was carried forward, on armor, on stone, on canvas, on the pages of every retelling the Western tradition has produced in the 3,000 years since the stories first hardened into their classical shapes, and in each century she arrived, changed, reinterpreted, made to mean whatever that particular moment most needed her to mean. That is not unusual for a mythological figure. What is unusual is how much she could bear. How many different meanings the same face could hold without collapsing into incoherence. The Gorgonian appeared on the Parthenon. It appeared on the coins of Syracuse. It appeared on Roman legionary shields marching into Gaul. It appeared on the breastplate of Alexander the Great. And in each of those contexts, it meant something slightly different. Protection, ferocity, divine sanction. The warning that the power carried here was not ordinary power and should not be tested. The face traveled. It accumulated meanings the way a stone accumulates the rings of everything that has pressed against it over time. The Renaissance found Medusa and could not look away. Leonardo da Vinci painted her, a lost work, described by contemporaries as so unsettling that viewers flinched. Caravaggio painted her twice, both times on a convex surface meant to mimic the very shield Perseus had used, so that the viewer's experience of the painting replicated, in miniature, the hero's experience of approaching the Gorgon sideways, through reflection, never quite direct. Caravaggio's Medusa is not hideous. She is horrified. Her mouth is open. Her eyes are wide. And the expression on her face is the expression of someone who has just understood what is happening to them. The severed head, aware of its own severing, looking out at the viewer from the last possible moment of its consciousness. It is one of the most psychologically precise images in the history of Western painting, and it is entirely about her interiority, not her monstrousness. Caravaggio gave her back a self in the moment of her ending. That is not an accident. That is a choice about what kind of story this is. The Romantic poets took her as an emblem of sublime terror. Percy Shelley wrote of the painting attributed to Leonardo with a reverence that bordered on the devotional, describing her as a beauty inseparable from its own capacity to destroy. Freud, working at the turn of the 20th century, claimed her head as a symbol of male castration anxiety, an interpretation that generated enormous influence and almost immediate contestation, and which says perhaps more about the particular preoccupations of Freud's cultural moment than it does about Medusa herself. But even that reading, reductive as it is, demonstrates the same essential thing every other reading demonstrates, that the image pulls, but it demands interpretation. That something in it refuses to settle. The most significant contemporary reinterpretation belongs to the feminist tradition, which, beginning in the latter half of the 20th century and accelerating into the present, has reclaimed Medusa not as a monster to be overcome, but as a figure whose story encodes a pattern of harm that remains entirely recognizable. The philosopher Hélène Sixshoes, in her 1975 essay, asked her readers to look at Medusa directly, to resist the Perseus instinct of avoidance and reflection, and declared that what they would find was not horror but laughter, vitality, the face of a woman who had survived being made into a warning and still had something left. The image of Medusa has appeared on protest signs, on gallery walls, on the covers of books about gender and power and the mythology of monstrousness. She has become a shorthand for what happens when power punishes the powerless and calls it justice. For what happens when a woman is made into a weapon against herself. None of these readings cancels the others. That is perhaps the most remarkable thing about her. She was a primordial terror before she was a woman with a story. She was a woman with a story before she was a symbol of divine punishment. She was a symbol of divine punishment before she became an emblem of protection. She was an emblem of protection before she became an instrument of heroic violence. She was an instrument of heroic violence before she became a subject of philosophical and feminist reclamation. She has been all of these things, in sequence and simultaneously, across an unbroken span of human meaning, making that stretches from the archaic pottery of 8th century Greece to the present moment. No other figure in Western mythology has traveled that distance while remaining so essentially, stubbornly itself. What she was, at the beginning, was a face that people could not stop carving. A pair of wide eyes staring directly outward from a pot, or a wall, or a temple frieze, confronting every viewer with the most primal of visual provocations. The direct gaze of something that might be dangerous, the unsettling sensation of being seen by something you are not sure sees you back. That face was old before Homer was born. It will be recognizable long after the last scholar has finished arguing about what it means. It does not require a story to do what it does to the human nervous system. The story was built around it over centuries by people trying to explain why they could not look away. She is still there, in stone, in paint, in print, in every retelling that begins, as all the best ones do, with the acknowledgement that before the monster there was a woman, and before the woman was made into a monster, something was done to her that the world has never fully decided how to reckon with. We have had 3,000 years to work it out. The face on the shield keeps looking back at us, patient and terrible, waiting to see if this time we manage it.